Edberg pulls up for three. Boom, knocks it down.
Curry from the corner at Bray, puts it in.
For overtime, makes it Garrett. Right.
Welcome to the MVP cast from me, Mark Woods, back after a few weeks' break with a guest who's gone a long way from home to make a big impression on foreign soil. He's a former Great Britain coach who's won all sorts of awards in the world of Canadian college basketball as the leader of the Dinos, otherwise known as the University of Calgary. Damian Jennings, welcome to the MVP cast.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the invite.
I mean, you've been away a while, but not forgotten over there. But I guess what I'd like to start with is Canadian college basketball. Obviously, we all know about the NCAA, the tournament and March Madness, yada yada. But Canadian college basketball, I guess, for most people, is a bit of a mystery. And now you coach in the Canada West Conference. It's a big country. But what's the standard like, and what's the setup of the conference and the league as a whole?
Great question. I get this asked quite regularly, mostly from British friends as well as around the world, because I think Canada up to now, certainly on the collegiate side, has almost fallen under the radar a little bit. And once you're here, you realize it shouldn't have, and for many good reasons. I mean, I think the main attraction outside of the contact and the connection to Ron Wattilla, who brought me over to interview and see if I could get the job to start off with, is really that valued student-athlete experience. And I'm not saying the NCAA doesn't offer that in certain measures, but just the way they sort of conduct their league across the whole country. I mean, we've got 48 schools now in 4 conferences, and the pacing of the schedule in the season just means that student aspect of student athlete is really looked after. And whether it's breaks for exams, where the exhibition games and the conference sits and how it finishes and what it does around that, it really does. It doesn't bombard the student athlete in a certain saturated point. Like, I think sometimes you probably look at the NCAA, and from the business side, we don't even batter an eyelid. But from the student athlete experience, you're wondering how on earth are they studying during February and March. But no, it's really kind of elongated and paced out that way a little bit, probably similar to what we'd call our domestic leagues in the UK and across Europe, where it's paced out over a little longer stretch. And they value that, and they're doing everything they can to sort of professionalize or create a higher performance, if you like, to the optics and the brand of what is now U Sports, our equivalent of the NCAA, and the 4 conferences that exist in it. But to describe its competitiveness, well, we beat NAIA schools and some lower Division 1s, Division 2s we tend to beat from a US Canadian example on the women's side. On the men's side, you quite regularly see the top guys like Carleton and the University of Calgary, who've just won the last 2 seasons worth of national championships, often beating several mid-major Division 1, Division 2 for sure, and NAIA schools. And of course, everything's infrastructurally based down in the US, so you can say Division 1, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're amazing at basketball. It is at the top end, but quite often it's infrastructural. And sometimes we've played some NAIA schools, some of these private schools that have chosen not to leap into the NCAA, and they're often tougher competition than some of the NCAA teams. So it's a really interesting thing to navigate and explain to individuals. But I guess the major difference that brings comfort or some understanding to international friends and UK friends is that it's a FIBA game in Canada. It's not the NCAA rules, and although the women's side on the NCAA has certainly started to has moved towards the 4 quarters and has a backcourt clock. I certainly remember my first year. I was at 2012. I inherited my schedule as far as exhibition, and we're off in December down to Montana, and I'm on the sideline there. I think we're in one of the first plays, and my teams are pressing transition teams, and I'm screaming at the referees and the table, which isn't normally my thing, but it goes to show also that my normal thing of preparation wasn't good enough, because I didn't realize there was no backcourt clock. And here we had a 30-second clock, and I'm going crazy after we've held them in the backcourt for over 12 seconds and with nothing materializing for us. So at that point, I said, I'm never going back, I'm never going south of the border. And but the emotions dropped, and of course you get great competition there. And now the backcourt clock, it really helps our FIBA style go down there and get some more worth sometimes of just not playing some Canadian schools. But yeah, it's a FIBA game in Canada, so 4 quarters. We've got the everything that changes at the same pace. The conferences review it, and the National League reviews it, and pretty much stays on pace with the rest of the world when it comes to FIBA. So when the 14-second shot clock came in, technical foul changes and any construction around there, and it gets reviewed straight away. They have the license to sort of take the Canadian version of FIBA, but it pretty much is international FIBA. And I love that. I think that sets us up to graduate players and give them an opportunity to go and play professionally somewhere if that's what they choose to do. And yeah, it's a very strong education background too. So it's very easy to send young Canadians or internationals that have come through our system out to Europe, Australia, or anywhere else. So very competitive. It's a very physical league. I enjoy it. It's a great challenge.
I mean, you've got to look at your stats. You've got a 68% winning record in your conference, and you reached national championships and towards the final stages of that. Obviously, we can't compare March Madness; it's huge. But what's the level of interest when you're in those last, the quarterfinals, semi-finals, teams getting to the final? How much do people sit and watch this throughout Canada?
Really popular. I mean, I think from the televised viewings, even if I create the female-male debate, actually there was more people. I believe Sportsnet, which is one of the coverage, one of the providers this season, said that there was more people watching and tuned in for the women's final than there were the men's, which was great. And it varies. I mean, it's very interesting to look at. I think even in the NCAA, if you look at sort of conference games, and we often take a look on, because obviously Synergy gives us that ability just to be able to scout and review. And even when you're out recruiting and you're looking at perhaps some Americans coming up or whatever it may be, the crowds are pretty similar during conference games in the main. And then obviously their arenas tend to get closer to the 7,000 on that side of things. But we have a 3,200 seater stadium, with a standing area as well, and that gets filled on 2 or 3 occasions throughout the year, and depending on who's in town, So if we've got just 3 hours north Edmonton, the University of Alberta, which is a historically very very well known, very competitive school, the University of Calgary versus University of Alberta, that's a huge game. Or you go back to even some contacts we both have in like the Ken Shields. Kathy Shields era. Ken worked with the national team in Britain with myself as well, and he was in charge of what was a dynasty at the time at UVic, the University of Victoria. So that University of Victoria, University of Calgary, University of Alberta, UBC in Vancouver, if they're ever in town, then you're going to get a full house, and it's fun to play in front of. And the national tournaments are put on very well. I mean, there's no way it's March Madness. It doesn't have that sort of endorsed or steeped history where people have just year on year come in their droves to come and support that. But it has its own version, and it's taking shape. But I think it's almost like the Canadians have a wonderful love for the US, almost like the Brits do when it comes to sport. So I think we all around the world somewhat watch in awe at times and want to be engaged with that. So it kind of almost supersedes a little bit what you have in your own backyard. And it's a shame, but it is what it is. And you can't mess with history. And they put on a business, right? You can't sort of use expressions like billion-dollar business and not be enamored by it. And U Sports certainly isn't a billion-dollar business. So yeah, it's not comparative on the scale of it, but the love and support for it right now is getting stronger and stronger, and the rebrand to U Sports and what they've done has been in part a really good move. I guess similar to me watching a little bit what's happened with the WBBL, and at the beginning when that was being looked at, I'm sure some people just thought it was going to be sort of superficial, and maybe some people still have that opinion, but certainly as an outsider now looking in, it looks like it's really created a nice polish and finish, and put the players on a more marketable basis, and I think that's what's happened to us here in the U Sports side of things.
Before you went, obviously you were coaching at Cardiff Met as it is now, and you were involved with the Great Britain teams under 20 and senior level. But you're presented with this potential opportunity. Ron Watilla comes along. You've spoken in the past to Ken Shields, so you've got a fair idea about what Canadian basketball is about. But what did you see in this opportunity that you thought, for my career, this is something I want to pursue?
Great question, because that reflection was over a period of time. I mean, and you were around in the thick of that with me at the time. So I've been so fortunate. I mean, to be part of that amalgamation when the three home nations got together, and I was really with the Welsh national team at the time in what has been changed from Division C to small nations, whatever competition you want to call that, to a stage where I am leading the program at Cardiff Met, but I'm a lecturer in the sports faculty there, and ultimately volunteering to run a club whilst coaching with which then became the national team in the U20s, and getting on the FECC, which changed a lot of what's happened for me. And that connection then to Ron Watilla is obviously a networking which we all talk about in life being such a fortune at times. And really, we're talking about 2007 to 2011 there, and I'm bringing in players of the ilk of like Steph Collins, Megan Hoffman, Janaea Wade-Frey at the time, Rose Anderson, Christy Shields, Hannah Shaw. These are all coming through the Cardiff setup, and the idea being that we would create almost like an academy of sorts to try and support them making the national team and in the build up to the Olympics. And at the time, I may have had 2 or 3 offers through an agent in the build up to 2011, and they were very tempting, because obviously I'm looking to think about, could I make a move professionally and do this full time? And interestingly, it just didn't feel right. I wanted to finish off what we started with, that cohort and that group of players on the precipice of an Olympic Games. And I think we probably all faced that moment where, you may have had some opportunities that to everyone else was like a no-brainer, and for you, your gut and your heart just said, nah, the timing's not quite right, even though I really want to do this. I want to do this full time. And then you go around the sort of, the bitter route as well, where you're angry. Why can't I be full-time coaching in the UK? And why do I have to teach? And all those sort of things. But I think that's just natural. But what was the main driver there is really just making sure that those players had a great opportunity and an environment and finish what we started. I brought them to Cardiff for that, and I felt that was where my heart and head was. And then lo and behold, the fortune continues. And of course, Ron Watilla moving back to Calgary, albeit just in part, and finishing off the job as the team manager with the Great Britain men's team. And him and his wife are from Calgary, and they were going back. And he asked me to come out in May in the build up to the Olympics. And really, at that point, I turned down a few options in Europe. And this just seemed like the right move for my wife and I, because it was English speaking. There was scope for my wife, who's a physiotherapist, to almost kickstart a second career, but it's still staying as a physiotherapist. Sadly, she did have to do her exams again for the degree school. It didn't cross over, but she managed to get through that, and grateful for that. But ultimately, it was kind of, okay, if this is the first time that a couple who eventually would start a family are looking to move into a new territory, which in other sort of markets, shall we say, is hired and fired after four losses, where there's a bit more security in the collegiate approach, certainly in Canada. And so it was weighing up a lot of things. And again, the move just felt right after the cycle that I'd finished with the Olympic Games, kind of capping off a number of players that had come through the Cardiff model that I'd started. And I guess just fortunate to know the right people at the right time, say no at the right time to things. And then, again, the cycle kind of just created itself that 2012 was the right time to move.
And here you are, 7 years later, still there.
Yeah, crazy, isn't it? Crazy.
We had Donna Finney, who you know well, on the podcast, and we were talking about the fact that being an international head coach, it's obviously it's different and it's distinct. How do you say that's benefited you, both in terms of the way maybe you look at the game compared to your peers in Canada, but also maybe in recruiting as well, in terms of maybe thinking outside the box, having slightly different contacts than others might have?
Yeah, I guess I'll never know the extreme end of that. You'd have to ask some of the players and the people that work around me. I would have thought to get the real weight of that international difference. I'd like to think that it's certainly like any walk of life. We're attracted to difference, and therefore we find difference a little bit more intriguing. So I guess coming over, the resume in part probably spoke differently to maybe the rest of Canada. So whether that attracted domestic recruits a little bit more differently, or just the impact we had instantly with a group that obviously I inherited in my first year, but still managed to get to national championships with them. I have to say, that the frustration is twofold when it comes to being a Brit, shall we say, in North America, because the best of Canada is looking over the fence at the US, and of course the best in the UK and is looking at the US as well, and we're chipping away at trying to changing and finding individuals with a slightly different approach to it than just that basketball experience only, even though we offer an incredible one, I think. But it is trying to sort of chip away at what ultimately people see as the US or nothing, or US or bust, whatever language you want to use. And I think, and I don't want it to make it a Canada versus US thing. I'm just sort of explaining the challenge, because everyone might have thought, well, here we have a British ex-senior team national coach, and every year I'm away from it, the less and less I have a relationship with British players. And of course, there are some incredible ones that are coming through that are 17, 18 right now, and they don't know me. Their coaches may know of me, but they don't know me. So it doesn't necessarily mean that automatically I have three British studs in my roster. Albeit we started obviously with Christy Shields when I brought her over from the UK, and then Freya later on, which was sadly with the injury. But yeah, it's been interesting. I would say the impact is probably more on just difference and intrigue, and how that resume jumps out, because it is different. And we're so fortunate in Europe to be close enough that if these opportunities are provided, like they were for me, that we can look very different. Whereas North America, it's a long way away to go. And if you get an international gig in Canada, then yes, you're doing the Americas. Yes, you're often traveling and playing in worlds and things like that. But it's not quite the same. The networking is not quite the same. Your exposure isn't quite the same. So I would say that side of just being different in that way. And but I now everyone knows who I am, so I don't know how much that means anything anymore.
How do you find it though with in Canada? Historically, the women's team internationally has always been pretty strong. The men's have fluctuated up and down, but we're now at that point where talent-wise, if not maybe performance-wise, Canada maybe is the second strongest basketball nation in the world for men. But what have you seen that they are doing so right? Because obviously population-wise, against Great Britain, not as big. Interest-wise, obviously much bigger, led by the Raptors, and I guess they're reaching the conference finals in the NBA. Everyone's going to be talking about it. But what are they doing on the ground that's working so well in bringing through high-quality talent?
It's a really great question, because obviously having a slightly, I'm in it, but also having the objectivity of someone who has, again, been fortunate enough to sort of almost, it's my background, sports development business, and studying how that's been done. When I was on the FECC course, that was a big part of the content, was just looking at youth development and, having an idea and using some of the blueprints from Europe, whether it's France, looking at the blueprint of Australia and what they did after their funding burst. Not so much the Asia, but just, and then Canada. And of course, optically, and it looks like they must be doing something incredibly different, and everyone needs to copy that. But I think that most geographies find a way of finding a system that, with their budgets and with their geography and their where the population is kind of sitting. And I think if you look deeper, the coaches are certainly getting better. There are, at U Sports, there are very few. I'm bad is the wrong word, but inexperienced seems to be the more professional term. But they're very good. They're good teachers. They're good. Their analytics are good. Their tactical IQ is good. At the top end in U Sports, you've got on the men's side a professional league that's just started up called CEBL, and that's going to be particularly good because it's marrying up with sort of graduating U Sports players and shall we say some professional Canadians that have gone out to Europe, Australia, wherever it may be, and then in the summer giving them something that's trying to put it again on the map at the next tier down underneath the Raptors. There's definitely an appetite for another franchise on the west side with Vancouver and obviously what's happened to them in the past. There's definitely an appetite for that. And then on the junior side of things, really the hub, if you like, is Ontario, and that kind of Hamilton, Toronto, and that kind of neighborhood. That is the basketball mecca, and that is on the girls and the boys side. And what you've got is a series of quite interesting changes, even in the last 7-8 years that I've been here, because you've got ultimately now the prep school model, and they went through a mini club model, which was separate from the schools, and that created its own challenge because it's very educational based, as you know, here in North America. So everything's kind of imitated in that way. They don't have clubs like we do, where you could be at a school that doesn't really offer you much sport and probably even wouldn't prioritize it. But the local club has you going from under 14s all the way up to 38 years old if you want to. They don't have that. They've got fragmented versions of it. And they're building that certainly on the men's side a little faster than the women's side. But everything is academic based unless it's spring, and then there'll be some club basketball. So what you tend to have here is you get prep kind of schools, and there's a very strong prep league in the Ontario bucket there. Here we tend to have the high school scene, certainly between mid-December to end of March. Then there's a short break, and then they get straight into spring club league. And then they have what they call their provincials, which is where they are playing for their provinces against the other provinces on a national stage. And it's all year round for them. But they very much value the non-specialization, which at times works well and sometimes doesn't. And sometimes I think the trip up here is defining specialization. I mean, in hockey, of course, their version, ice hockey, that is basically a religion here. They specialize very, very early. But you'll still find basketball players playing volleyball for their school team all the way up until grade 12. And sometimes that means that perhaps the time spent on basketball isn't quite as intense as other sports have chosen to. But and then so it's fragmented, and then obviously they have the provincial setup. So it's really interesting. There's a lot coming out of that Ontario section, and then if you go down a roster and maybe you've looked at the U17s, U19s level, you'll see that it is very Ontario based, with one or two hits of Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, or possibly even Quebec or Nova Scotia. But you're talking one or two hits on a 12-player roster. So you can understand where the crux of it is. And because of that, then that geography, which is ultimately a 3-hour maximum, often just an hour and a half drive between those prep schools, you've got some really good competition going on. You've got the education aspect, and you've got effectively then academies that are attracting the best coaches, the best athletic development coaches as well, and you've got a recipe for almost like a centralized system, but yet not having it only come out of like Paris has got INSEP, I could argue that Canada's got Ontario. It's got an intense geography in itself.
Quick thought on, if you will, on the buck system, because obviously you coached in that, and some universities have made their ambitions very clear in that. Some say, like Northumbria, have got big and then pulled the plug on it because there wasn't a return on investment. Do you see any kind of parallels in the way that bucks in certain universities, including Cardiff, were trying to grow what they're doing in Canada, or is it just too different and too different a scale at this point in time?
Yeah, I think it goes back to my previous comment. I mean, if you ask me the question on sometimes what has been the hardest challenge for you when I came to Canada, it was really dealing with the fact that there wasn't a second team, and we don't have the red shirt status as a concept. So for me, talking to players at the end of the week who were decent players, that you didn't have basketball at the end of the week was almost upsetting, for want of a better expression, because to me, the beauty of what we had in the UK, albeit trying to find its feet with financial infrastructure, human resource, development of coaches, development of players, facilities, whatever, roadblocks we considered our issues, there was always basketball for someone. And maybe that's just the club model in general, whereas here it isn't. So for me, and that's why the Bucks, or shall we say, having a club based at a university was such a win-win, is that we were able to facilitate and provide everything for anyone in our catchment area. Whether you're a student and the best you're ever going to do is be a Bucks second team player, which then meant you might play in, I don't know, Division 2 National League, or if it ever got to Division 3s and 4s, like the men have been able to provide on a regionalized basis. And then you had the Bucks Premier, which of course it had the games where you'd go and play teams and you'd walk away with a 40, 50, 60-point win, and no one wants that. But it also had some really tough games for probably half a dozen schools. And then half of that team, if not more of it, depending on your model, would go and play at the time in the England Division 1, and now you've got WBBL. And I was saddened to see the Northumbria decision because, I know money talks, but we have to get braver in that. And I think that the UK has, until you've stepped out of the country, you realize actually there's a lot of promise and there's a lot of potential that it does just require, sadly, that little financial input, the passionate leadership, which is often in many of the clubs, and just that little leg up to be brave in the short term, to see what can happen in the long term. But a model that includes Bucks and university sport, for me, linked to clubs in the UK, is definitely the way forward. And it's sad when you see that, particularly with the history of it, and Northumbria and Cardiff and my background with them go back a long way. So I was sad to see that, but of course I think, and again, excuse my ignorance, but I think that the Newcastle Eagles have kind of picked up the pieces a little bit from there and moved it along. And great to see that Edinburgh and what they are doing. And again, I'm sure closer to home, people are more critical of what's been happening, but from further afield, but with a loving kind of watch over it. It's just good to see people having a go.
Let's pause the podcast for just a moment to ask for your help. We'd like to produce more episodes of the MVP cast. That's more conversations and more stories you've not heard before from around the world of basketball. To do that, we'd love your support in becoming a patron. If you value the show, why not pledge a few pounds each month to help keep it going? We'll even give you a shout out as our way of saying thank you. Find out more by going to MVP 24/7, clicking on the podcast page and going to the patron link.
Damian Jennings is our guest this time. And Damian, you mentioned earlier Great Britain, and you were talking there, slightly reminiscing about past times, but you coached the senior team. We'll talk about the under 20s as well, but you coached that senior team at the Eurobasket 2013, finished ninth, still I think the best finish. And then you walked away from it, I guess, because of the job in Canada. But how much of a wrench was it for you to, having been with that program and brought through some of those players through the under 20s, coached them at club level, and how much did it sort of pang or eat away at your heart to go, I've got to give this up?
Yeah, very much so, and on many levels. I mean, the most importantly was that I loved it, and nothing on the scale of it apart from obviously I've just taken, I've just finished my first year of a full-time job. Someone's actually paying me to coach basketball full-time, and really nothing else, which in itself sometimes you have to keep pinching yourself. But to me, that's the highest level. Certainly on the women's side, it's one of the highest and most competitive and most challenging levels of basketball, and I've grown up, if you like, with that intensity of I won't class it just as European basketball, because obviously we've played further afield as well, but that European intensity for now, I'll call it that, because whether it's tournaments at the youth level or the senior level, but I just loved it. I thrived on that experience, and almost needed it year in, year out. I look forward to it. It was almost the chance where I don't know which one was the playground, whether I looked at basketball, and again, I didn't get too many opportunities at the senior level just in the 2013 period, but using the domestic season to kind of trial what you'd like to do with your international teams, whether that was the junior teams building up or, and everything that I'd learned through Tom and Ken and Mark and Sergio and the group of us and Vanessa, that we'd kind of put that together over what was an intense short period of time after the amalgamation of the countries, and then really the full-time job became the priority. And for those who have coached will understand this better than those that haven't, but most of the fatigue of coaching is actually in the 3 months prior to any campaign. Because, and rightly so at times, because you're building relationships with players either you don't have, and you're starting to bring them in, particularly on the national team level, where every year we were bringing in new players. And of course, the fortune that Britain has also been able to provide some of its young and middle-aged players, in the sense of getting more exposure and getting professional contracts, and those being committed to and moving along to different clubs. And in the end, thank goodness for technology, but you are having conversations on so many different time zones, and organizing that before you even start to look at, what we had built, which is quite a professional infrastructure from a sports science point of view. So just from staying in contact with staffing, setting all those aspects up, the scheduling, being linked in with your team manager at the time, and obviously, but being on different time zones, it was very, very challenging. And again, if you look at the Canada West Conference, we play 2 games a week. So we're on the road for 4 days out of 7 every other week. And I did it, and we did well in 2013, but I didn't feel I did as good a job as I could. And maybe the pride aspect and me wanting Great Britain to have the best level of service from its head coach. And I know, and maybe on reflection, I felt that it was partly my responsibility, of course it is, as the head coach, that we did finish 9th, which goes on record as the best finish, but you're 1 place off looking at a World Cup entry. And I struggled with that, but I wanted Great Britain to have the best prep opportunity possible, and I just felt that I wasn't able to provide that full on as a head coach. And of course, being such a proud Brit from a basketball point of view, I wanted to offer my services where I could, so supported Peter Buckle and as best as I could after that. But really the FIBA change kind of wrote us off a little bit here in North America. So, it's frustrating for Great Britain, I think, because it had done so well, but we still were offering young coaches like myself our major opportunities to do it full time. It meant we had to get off the island. So here I am in Canada. Our players are in the States if they're youthful, and we were a country that are obviously bleeding youth and wanting to and needing to, whether it was the build up to the Olympics or even afterwards. And perhaps Europe hasn't had to do that so much. So they weren't as punished, I don't think, by the February, November qualifying change as we were. But we've also seen the fruits of all that labor from the start. Even going back to the home nations before that in the Mark Clark era, what he did in connecting some of those players, it wasn't even on their radar to go and play professionally, to now the setup that Great Britain has, and it's able to have players that are now beyond their education in the NCAA, perhaps, or overseas and be playing in Europe. And then suddenly these windows that are the qualifiers in November and February, similar to the soccer model, are actually starting to work for the UK and Britain. But for me, sadly, on a personal level, just to be selfish for a second, it's frustrating because I would love nothing more than to be coaching with or coaching my country.
Do you think the one positive is you did get to be head coach at one point? Because I guess if you'd been assistant and you've been on the journey you are now, where you're making a name for yourself as a coach, and not to have had that chance at some point, would it be sitting there going, "Oh, I really missed out"?
Yeah, I mean, there's no bitterness or anger or anything else really. I reflect on it with great fondness and joy, and from everyone that I've met, whether it's from your side of the world in it, to the other coaches, to the players across other countries, to the players. I mean, I'm so fortunate. I mean, from 2007 to 2012, and then to take a group and to take even like Kim Butler as the captain of that 2013 group, and Chantal Handy was just coming into her own, and you've got the unbelievable sort of efforts and commitment of the Steph Collins and Rachels of the world, and to see some of the youth like Temi and Ella and Georgia and Dominique come through, and we've done 2 World University Games together, we've done under-20s together, we've the Olympics together, and it's nothing but fondness. FIBA's a lot bigger than Damian Jennings' woes, so for them to move to qualifiers, that makes sense for them. It's just, I'm perhaps just the the byproduct of that, but I'm coaching full time, and there are, I'm sure, hundreds and hundreds of coaches in the UK that would love to be doing what I'm doing. So there's no anger here. It's, as you say, I look back with great fondness on that period. Who knows what happens in the future? I'm really pleased to see how well they've done. They've done an unbelievable job at the Commonwealths, and obviously with Canada being in that as well, and watching it from in here, it was fascinating to watch. And I'm just really proud of what's been going on now. And I think the other pride can be genuinely felt, without wishing to turn it back to myself, but even go back to the eras of the Mark Clark and period and the home nations before it. There's a lot of foundations that have been put in place, and a lot of hard work, and that includes the governing body, just the Chris Spices, the Rons, Warwick Cans of the world, to I don't have to name drop, but the Toms and the Kens and everyone that's been influenced on that. It's all having a great influence on that now, and it's just wonderful seeing those players playing very well on the top stage, and really pleased for the coaches and the players.
I guess the fear is, and I don't know how much you really keep tabs and all, but I guess the fear is that structure was in place. And I was speaking to Chris Spice recently, who's now with British Swimming, and we were talking about the structure that was there. And obviously there was much more money, and no one can ever get away from that fact. But that structure is still bearing fruit. But now that structure's gone. If you came back in 5 years' time and say you ended up as GB coach in 5 years' time, I'm not sure you would have the players provided by the structure that isn't really there anymore.
Yeah, and that's the sad part. You asked me the questions about Canada on the youth end particularly, and of course the commentary starts because they are on the senior level on the women's side slowly but surely becoming top 2, top 3, top 4, and I'm sure Spain and has something to say about that and things. But ultimately they're doing incredible things, and part of that has been their own the podium funding. The senior team doesn't have to want for anything to take them to the next level. They can get it. They have the performance analysis and sports science aspects that are helping them communicate with their players all around the world. They have ID camps for their youth, and so they're not missing people. People aren't falling through the nets, and they have these frequently throughout the year to the senior inputs, and they've got the funding to be able to go and sit themselves in Europe and say who wants to play us, or go down to Oceania and say who wants to play us, and sit themselves there without any concern about we're a day over making the governing body bankrupt or whatever it may be. And Great Britain has been there before, where it's been able to make performance decisions. So yeah, it's sad. it's not alone. I mean, many other countries go through that. We certainly were very exposed to, when we were doing all our preparation, whether we were often going to play Croatia or France or Lithuania or wherever it may have been, listening to their coaches after we'd played a couple of games, and you sat in the hotel bar or restaurant and you're just talking about each other's situations. And Britain's possibly back level now on that side of things with some other countries. But if your ambitions are to the top end, which Canada certainly has, then that needs to be well funded. And of course, they own the podium stuff here. So, yeah, very sad. I'm not sure what it will look like in 5-10 years' time. You'd like to think that the mantle presented by the current level of play and the service that those senior players, and that's the thing that makes me the most proud, I think, of the players, is just seeing some of the older guard continuing to serve and want to play, albeit with, because they've been exposed to those scenarios, and everyone says, oh, well, it's country first. And yes, it is. But the more you get into professional sport and the international and the clash that's going on all around the world with professional sports, I mean, I don't even think Canada can get its hockey team, which is its religion, it's its number one sport. And on the men's side, it's like all our challenges with Lowell Deng when it came to insurance for his back. It's like, imagine that on a 20-player roster on the scale of the NHL and what Canada goes through, and that's not going away. And I know we may not feel it at the same intensity on the women's side, but we have a significant number of players that are either embarking on an NCAA U Sports sort of collegiate career, or they're playing professionally and have chosen to and see a future in it. So therefore, playing for your country obviously helps that side grow. If we're trying, I don't want to make it all selfish on the players' side, because most of them love playing for the country. But when you've been exposed to what we were exposed to, particularly between 2010 and even though it came down a notch to 2013, to where it possibly is now. And again, I can't comment too much, but how you're describing it, it's moving a long way away from where it was. Kudos to them for continuing to see it as country first and not the remuneration or the other parts of the package.
But I guess we may look back as the heady days when the under-20 coach got paid for their role. I mean, that's
yes,
that is already now a bygone era. But I guess you're fortunate you're going to be in a time zone this year. You can watch you'll have to get up early, watch the Eurobasket or whatever. But I mean, will it give you a sort of reflected pride that I think you probably have coached half the team, depending on who the final squad is. But when they go for that world or the Olympic qualification, etc., I guess when you sit back somewhere early in the morning in your office and go, with your little flag on or a little GB top or whatever, and go, yeah, come on.
Oh, absolutely. And it's every competition they're in. And, my wife and I might be either with our daughter just sat there behind a laptop, whether it was at the Commonwealth Games or whatever it's been, whether it's been the sort of friendly test games or the genuine qualifiers. I mean, I don't think there's any fan now. That's the beauty, isn't it, of the time that we've all been around it, is that our players are recognizable players in Great Britain, and that's taken a long time. And they can be very, very, very proud of that. And long may it continue. And it sounds and seems like the next level of talent is coming through, who hopefully will be the names that we can spiel off pretty quickly at the top end of the roster. And so from that end, and I guess what WBBL and other aspects of domestic basketball is doing means that coaches are getting better, that therefore the teaching's getting better. And if we can recruit that talent from a younger age, we can have a lot more options basketball-wise going forward. So at the end of the day, it's not just about your financial infrastructure. It's about the quality of your teaching and the quality of the athletes that are coming through the basketball flow. And as long as that continues, then people will put British jerseys on and they'll go out and play.
You mentioned your daughter there. We're both parents of 2-year-olds, and it's a challenging thing. You're on the road 4 days a week. How are you managing this challenge? And I guess the answer to that has been my wife Danny is the person that makes it all possible.
Absolutely, the perfect wife. And of course, she's a basketball player background-wise, and we came over for what ultimately was my career, and part of the decision was making sure that her career, from a physio point of view, could work here, and it does. And she now has a wonderful setup at a private clinic that is based at a huge YMCA around the corner, and so we're very fortunate. Everything's just kind of aligned to try and get that. Because, as you know, it's a unique thing trying to fit a lifestyle once you have a child on board with what ultimately doesn't mix well. Certainly at the younger age. I mean, I have every faith that my choice of being a basketball coach at this time is going to pay her back as a young person, or being around sport, being around role models, being around female role models. And I'm going to really enjoy just that point where you don't have to stop them from killing themselves every 2 seconds to just leaving her in a gym whilst I coach. And, you know, that becomes part of just not having to use childcare support and all the other things that come with it. But yeah, she's in a great day home, and my wife still manages to work 4 very intense kind of shifts as a physio, and then we just work around it, and whether that's a late pickup, early drop off, and then obviously that she doesn't work the 5th day, which means she gets a day, and we try and spend as much time together as possible. When certainly around the home games because we go Friday, Saturday back to back. And then on the road, yeah, it's intense for mum, but she loves it. I love it, and it doesn't make it easier to leave, but certainly she's brought great joy to our life, and it is a juggling act, though.
I find the greatest peril is not that they kill themselves, as I found out at the recent BBL Trophy final, is that they run on the court while you're sitting at the courtside, and then
everyone knows it's your child.
And everyone then again gets stopped. Unfortunately to me, it only happened in a warm-up game, but you know, the recurring nightmares ever since. That's the biggest problem, I think, with 2-year-olds.
Yeah, with your surname written on the jersey on the back.
Everyone knows. But Frank, I mean, obviously with parenthood and the coaching, you used to be a big golfer. Are you still managing to keep that up?
I love golf, and it's fascinating here because, again, to try and explain the geography is that, you know, I'm sat here in my office at home, and I'm literally looking over the Rocky Mountains with snow-capped mountains from the window. I wish I could put you on FaceTime and show you the picture. It's a beautiful spot, but to have that dramatic backdrop of what is absolutely stunning and only 40-minute drive away means that you do have snow for anywhere between 3 to 5 months of the year, but pretty rare here because we have the Chinook winds that come through and just kind of take it out a little bit. But so golf here is a really small window, and people are golf crazy. I mean, the amount of money they spend on it is just... it's nuts, really. If I think back to my membership around the corner where I was in Cardiff, I think I first started playing in 2010 after being invited to the Ryder Cup, having never wanted to play golf ever because it just looked boring and it didn't mean hitting anyone. I wasn't interested. To going to the Ryder Cup and watching Tiger Woods at the driving range, and just went, oh, I want to have a go at this. So, and then was smitten after that. And I think I paid £500 for a membership to Peterston Lakes Golf Club down the road in Marshall, just outside Cardiff. And now people are spending memberships with $15,000 equities to the one around the corner, and $3,500 yearly dues, whatever they call them. And it took almost £5,000 worth of it for what is ultimately, I mean, it's only just opened 2 or 3 weeks ago because we had a pretty long winter. And will be shut up again by September, and people are paying a fortune to do it. It's just golf crazy. So I've loved that summer as summer exposure to golf, because obviously I didn't have it when I was back coaching in the UK. Whereas here it's kind of almost gone around. I used to play in the mud of December, January, February, March, and got out every now and again if anyone wanted to play in and around the GB basketball stuff in the summers. Whereas coming to Calgary, I've never played warmer golf, but with Sienna, our daughter, now it's become a lot more challenging, and I'm spending a lot more time at home in the off season and valuing that time. And yeah, I'm a bit of an all or nothing creature, so I have to say this summer has been it won't see much golf. Last summer saw a very reduced amount, but the year before I was probably playing 60 rounds if I could get that done between June and end of August.
No coincidence the year before you did not have a child.
Yes, there we go. That's it. You've done the calculation.
Cause and effect.
Correct. Yes.
Final question, Damian, before we let you go. Obviously, you've been there now 7 years. What is the future? Where do you see? Well, obviously, a coach will always say, "I'm happy in my current job. I'm enjoying it. I'll stay here as long as they want me." But for you, where do you see it? Is it Canada for forever? Is it moving south of the border if an opportunity came? Is it a huge European job? Where do you see the next stage?
Well, great question. And I think because you've alluded to and trying to connect me back to some feelings towards the national team stuff and just being around the adult end of the game, because I do miss that. I love what I do. I love the collegiate experience, certainly going into work and working with 18 to 24-year-olds in the main and basically setting them up for what is the afterlife from education. And the challenge of that is enduring it. Like, it does not, and I get older, but they stay the same age. So you're going through this cycle all the time. But I do miss being around, the 35-year-old who you've seen through with that basketball IQ and going to battle with that group. So I don't know specifically what the future holds right now. I think, as you probably know, that once you have start a family and you certainly have a young one, you start to concentrate just on today a little bit more, not just getting through it, but enjoying it. I'm very loyal as a natural disposition. So I haven't achieved the things I'd like to achieve with Calgary. And that's not to say that if that gets achieved sooner rather than later, that there's a new finish line. But I do miss the adult end of it. But to your other sort of point of potential view, obviously south of the border on a remuneration point of view, but they've got their own challenges. They have a model which almost is unapologetically promotes from within. So you might have to start back at dare I say, at the bottom again, as far as third assistant with performance analysis role type of situation to get up to being a head coach there. And I'm not saying I'm old, but I'm not sure whether I'm prepared to do that on a full-time basis when you have the autonomy that I have right now in Calgary. And it's a long-winded way of saying, as you put, I'm happy with what I'm doing. I have a young family, and I suspect it'll be expanded slightly. And that side of things means that I have to take that into consideration. But I'm ambitious, but I'm ambitious for the club that I'm with, and that's the University of Calgary. And who knows what happens? When you're not looking, often great opportunities come your way, and you must review them. But for now, we love where we live. I mean, it's such a beautiful part of the world, and we're so fortunate to be able to either go to lakes in the British Columbia, Okanagan Valley, to we can literally on a Sunday morning after some really intense games, the three of us just go out 40 minutes in the car, have a coffee at the foot of probably the most beautiful looking mountains, to do a small hike, come back home, and you've been out for 2 or 3 hours, and just to be able to rejuvenate like that. And you kind of ask yourself, well, sometimes it's not just about the basketball gig, it's about everything else too. And I'm enjoying the basketball gig as well. So very, very happy, and we'll see what happens. But I'd say the most definite ... is I do miss working with older players.
Well, there you go. The Masters basketball circuit beckons for Steph Collins should be there. She'll be playing. Don't you? Right. Anyway,
yeah, I'm sure.
Anyway, it has been great to hear all about your journey over on the other side of the Atlantic, and we wish you continued success both in this summer and playing some golf, and in next years ahead at the University of Calgary. But Damian Jennings, thank you so much for your time and for joining us on the MVP cast.
Thank you, Mark. Just to say, anyone who knows me, who's listening to this, I miss you all, and I watch and observe. My communication with the network is poor, and I apologize for that. But I do think about you all often, and anyone I met through Great Britain basketball from all sides of it, I watch, and I wish you all the best, and I really appreciate you reaching out, Mark.
A big shout out from Damian. There you go. Thanks, Damian.
Right.
That is it for this edition. You can download past editions by subscribing at your preferred podcast provider or stream them at our website, mvp247.com, where you can also pick up all the latest basketball news. Another edition coming very soon, but for now, from me, Mark Woods, it's bye for now.